Welcome to a new episode of Film Seizure at the Movies. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the Film Seizure podcast that you can catch on Wednesdays with my cohorts Jason Oliver and Chuck Moore, and my solo show Monster Mondays that you can listen to every Monday afternoon. You can catch both of these shows at filmseizure.com. And welcome to this kind of special episode of Film Seizure at the Movies. And what's kind of interesting is that this is a special episode that's for a movie that I wouldn't say is overly special in the confines of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, barring a couple of concepts and ideas that were furthered or introduced in this film itself. Instead, there's a lot of other things that kind of swirl around this movie that I wanted to touch upon. I know I'm a little bit late to the party to make a review for this movie that's now 3 weeks old, but that's kind of part of the whole thing. Originally, I planned to do a review of Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness during the opening weekend. Then when I really didn't put anything together, I thought, well, I'd save it for a week or so and do something that could do a little bit more spoilers. Then that passed, and I thought, nah, I'll just pass this one up and not talk about it. I didn't think I had anything really all that special to say, because you could probably guess that I do quite like this movie. I like the Marvel movies. But I'll get to more of that in a bit. When I saw this movie the second time on May 7th, just before the movie started, I saw the notification on Facebook that my all-time favorite comic book artist, hell, my favorite artist, period, George Perez, had passed away the night before. And that hit me pretty hard. However, the more I'm removed from that day and hearing the news, the more that news tied itself into the whole structure of how I feel about Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. And in retrospect, the Disney Plus series that the movie sequelized, WandaVision. So I am going to talk about both of these tales because the movie can't really be watched without the TV series, and the TV series is continued by the movie. They live kind of in a symbiotic relationship. I'm going to go a little bit further, though, because I do want to talk about George Perez. I could go into his early years as the son of Puerto Rican parents and how he was a self-taught artist that was purely unique in his composition and attention to detail. This is something we've all heard, or you can read from his Wikipedia page or the numerous tributes since his cancer diagnosis last year and more since his death on May 6th. I want to go a little bit more personal because he was a major part of my love of collecting comics when I was a little younger. Trust me, this will all wrap its way back around to WandaVision and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, so just hang tight. I collected comics as a kid in the mid to late 80s, and I stopped at some point before the 90s for several reasons, but probably the most important one was cost and access to the stores I used to go to after I moved away from them. It's funny to think about cost being prohibitive in the 80s when comics were about 20% of the cost they are today, but I digress. I was a kid who had single parents. It wasn't like money was flowing and I had to pick and choose what my entertainment spending would be. I always stuck close to comics, though. I mean, I loved the comic book movies like Batman and the things that came out in cartoons and so forth. But about 10 years later in 1998, I got back in full force with my own money as a guy in his early 20s with a job, and I got hooked fast. Interestingly, the comic that brought me back was the first issue of Dark Horse Comics' Buffy the Vampire Slayer series. But going into comic shops, it really didn't take me very long at all before I jumped right back into Marvel with both feet and revisited my childhood heroes, in particular Thor, Spider-Man, and the Avengers. At the time, the Avengers were involved in these huge comic booky stories with good guys fighting bad guys, and everything was sunshine hero versus obvious villain. It's what I love about comics and what Marvel was dishing out in the books I was buying at the time. The Avengers was being written, that series was being written by Kurt Busiek, who had an encyclopedic knowledge of Marvel characters, and the series was being drawn by George Perez, who loved drawing just about any character that you gave him to draw. To this day, I don't think I would pick any two creators to work on a series if I could have my pick of all the writers and artists throughout the 80 plus years of superhero comics. It was just so vibrant and so full of life and dynamic dialogue and movement. When I think about comics in general, I think about those Avengers books from the late 90s. Two major stars who came from that run were the Scarlet Witch, Wanda Maximoff, and her former lover and husband, the Vision. Now, despite my love for Thor and Captain America, Wanda and Vision were my favorite Avengers, period. They were the heart and soul of that team. I could go way more into about the dynamics of other members of the team, but I'm going to try to keep this on track. One of the most important character developments of the time was that of the burgeoning powers of the Scarlet Witch. It was like she was more tapped into her chaos magic powers than ever before. There was an entire story about how an evil sorceress was using Wanda to create an entire medieval world to imprison the Avengers in. There was a story about how Wanda's incredible powers could be a match for hundreds of Ultron robots. There was a story in which she brought somebody back from death. She was a star of this series. However, Wanda Maximoff had a history of being fragile. She was raised by the X-Men arch-villain Magneto to be part of his Brotherhood of Evil Mutants with her hot-headed brother Quicksilver. She harbored a lot of ill will for a long time. She was potentially being manipulated by a cosmically bad demon called Chthon, and she would find happiness with Vision, and she literally conjured two children out of pure magic. But when they disappeared, she was utterly wrecked. It would later be a cause for her to go completely insane well after Busiek and Perez had left the title. I'll get around to that in a little while. But this was a character who was always borderline ready to go evil at any moment, and did a few times in her history. Now, the way that Wanda Maximoff was adapted for the Marvel Cinematic Universe was smartly stripped down. You had no X-Men, Magneto, or mutants. So she was apparently given her powers by one of the Infinity Stones that played a huge part early on in the MCU. She was manipulated by Ultron to strike out against the Avengers because Tony Stark had built the weapons that ravaged her homeland in a civil war. But her powers were also building and compounding. But it was very likely due to a series of tragedies. At the end of Avengers Age of Ultron, her first appearance, she lost her twin brother Pietro, who we mostly know in the comics as Quicksilver. The next time we see her in Captain America Civil War, her use of powers that was originally intended for good ended up creating a tragedy that led to the Avengers breaking up and fighting amongst themselves, including her fighting against her soon-to-be lover, Vision, when she sided with Captain America and Vision sided with Iron Man. When we next see her in Avengers Infinity War, she was now living a happy life in secret with Vision. But by the end of the movie, she must kill him to prevent Thanos from obtaining the final Infinity Stone that he planned to use to wipe out half of all the living things in the universe. Now, unfortunately, that was all for naught, as he was able to reverse time with the use of another one of the Infinity Stones and take it from Vision himself, making her sacrifice meaningless. For her troubles, she was one of the half of all the beings in the universe turned to dust by Thanos simply snapping his fingers and creating his vision of balance in the cosmos. When she returned 5 years later in Avengers Endgame, after they resolved all of the issues with all the missing life, she helped defeat Thanos, but she would not be reunited with the Vision, as his death was not something that was reversible. So you might see there that Wanda's life is utterly soaked in sadness and loss. The only time in which she was not bottomed out in grief in Civil War, she was basically carrying the weight of being blamed for the collateral damage that puts the Avengers in a pretty negative light. And then, of course, the infighting that occurred after that. And so we come to her TV series, WandaVision. What happened after Wanda Maximoff leaves Tony Stark's funeral at the end of Endgame? Well, she has apparently settled down in the town of Westview, New Jersey. She's living there with Vision in an idyllic 50s sitcom home and zany situations that are caused by Vision being an android and Wanda being a magic user. But wait. How is that possible? For one, Vision is most definitely dead. And for two, I'm pretty sure the Marvel Universe does not take place in the same universe and time as the Dick Van Dyke Show. So as WandaVision carries on through its series of 9 episodes, we learn that Wanda is not just manipulating her world around her home life, traversing through several decades and styles of old sitcoms, but she's also manipulating the poor people of this small town to play out roles and purposes to fit her perceived happy scenarios in life. It's very clear that as the series goes on, Wanda is cracking up and losing her sanity. It's such a very well done story that it follows because the surface of the show is bright and seemingly happy. Yeah, there's some weird stuff that might happen here or there, but Wanda is happy. Vision apparently is still alive, and they have fun adventures. And she even gives birth to twins, Tommy and Billy, that begin to grow up very fast. And it all seems so pleasant and picture perfect. However, underneath it all, it's dark, and what she's doing is evil. It's a perfectly set up premise. The idea that you are seeing a woman that you yourself are kind of falling in love with because of how fluffy and cuddly Elizabeth Olsen plays the role, that you don't want to think of her as being the obvious villain, that she's also kind of taking part in all of the negative stuff in the series. So when people have moments of breaking out of the spell that she's placed the town in, they are terrified and confused and in some mental anguish. It's terrible. Oh, and the Vision? Well, he's basically a zombie. She stole his remains and reanimated him herself. And yes, we're even thrown a curveball when Agatha Harkness claims to be behind everything. However, she's only giving Wanda the push needed for Wanda to fulfill the prophecy of becoming the Scarlet Witch. Wanda is indeed the one who started the trouble in Westview by taking over the town and defending it against an agency trying to stop and help her. The series ends with her losing her magically created children, which fills her with pain and sadness yet again. She does free Westview and retreats with a tome called the Darkhold, and she uses it to learn of the multiverse where she, now as the Scarlet Witch, can search for her missing children. All's well that ends well. Westview is freed. There is a white version of the Vision that is flying about now because the government built their own, and the original Vision, before he was rendered inoperable again with Wanda's magic fading from the town, transferred his consciousness to the new version, so he's around too. Seemingly, Wanda can find her missing children. That's great, right? No. Remember, Wanda has been portrayed this entire time as a tragic character. So moving on to Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. I should say that there's going to be heavy spoilers. So if you haven't seen the movie and you're interested in keeping spoilers light, then you probably don't want to listen any further. But in this movie, Doctor Strange meets a peculiar teenage girl who has some pretty nifty powers. She can punch portals to access other universes within the multiverse. However, this girl, America Chavez, is being hunted by someone or something. It's already chased her through several different universes and has killed at least one Doctor Strange. When she enters the MCU's universe, our Doctor Strange decides, along with his trusty companion Wong, to protect Chavez and enlist the help of Wanda Maximoff, since she has some idea of the magic being used and the concept of the multiverse. But SpaghettiOs, she is the person who has been hunting America all along. She's completely consumed by the Darkhold and her identity as the fabled Scarlet Witch. As Strange and Chavez escape through the multiverse, they encounter an Earth that has protection from the Illuminati, a council of sorts of the best heroes that Earth had to offer. On this is Captain Carter, a version of Peggy Carter who took the super soldier serum instead of Steve Rogers. Maria Rambeau, Carol Danvers' friend from the Air Force, who becomes that universe's Captain Marvel. Baron Mordo, our Strange's own arch nemesis in the regular MCU. Black Bolt, King of the Inhumans. Professor Charles Xavier of the X-Men. And Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four. While they try to figure out what to do with Doctor Strange, because his multiverse hopping could potentially lead to a universe-shattering event called an incursion, Wanda uses a different form of multiversal travel, dreamwalking. This is where she can take control of the body of another Wanda Maximoff in another universe. She uses this Wanda to utterly destroy the Illuminati in one of the most brutally horrific scenes shown in any Marvel movie yet. It's pretty much a horror movie at this point. Doctor Strange eventually has to learn to do his own dream walking to return to the main MCU to battle Wanda one last time. When she realizes that she really cannot take her children away from another version of herself in another universe, she decides the only way to defeat herself and the Darkhold's power over her is to destroy the temple built for her at the fabled Mount Wundagore, which is an old comic book location. Which basically destroys every version of the Darkhold across the multiverse. She seemingly perishes in this final act. So let me give you general reviews of both WandaVision and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness in terms of their quality as a series and as a movie. WandaVision is among the very best that Disney Plus has released yet. Between that and Loki, both of those series are firing on all cylinders. WandaVision, as I mentioned previously, is engrossing but also enjoyably misleading in what you're supposed to think of our main character, Wanda Maximoff. It puts a spell on you, and it's something you hope against hope that will work out well for everyone, even though you know that Wanda's done some pretty messed up things to innocent people. I went into that earlier, and it's just a very well-constructed, fun, yet something that can kind of make you think type of series. So Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness is also a lot of fun. I would not say that this is a top-tier Marvel movie for me. Honestly, the top 8 or 9 Marvel movies may never be penetrated, and all things considered, but even though I will say that this is a pretty good middle-of-the-road Marvel film in terms of quality, rewatchability, and what have you, that's not a slight on the film at all. Sam Raimi is able to do some pretty neat stuff and some very characteristic things when it comes to his style. There are absolutely moments in which you see something and think, yep, Sam Raimi made this movie. And like I said, it gets to a point in the movie in which it becomes a horror movie, plain and simple. There are a couple of pretty good jump scares that are well earned, and the evil version of Elizabeth Olsen is pretty damn terrifying. Yet, because I do love her and the Scarlet Witch as a character, also incredibly appealing. And speaking of Elizabeth Olsen, for as good and as much as Benedict Cumberbatch owns his portrayal of Stephen Strange, Olsen owns pretty much every one of the best scenes of this movie. She's every bit the star of this movie as Cumberbatch is. He's almost just kind of, Strange is almost just kind of holding on and barely escaping Wanda as she hunts him and America Chavez. He does have some really good scenes with Benedict Wong, appropriately playing the character Wong, as well. I would have to say that the character of America Chavez is unfortunately maybe the least interesting character. And that's not really a slight on her either. She's basically the MacGuffin of the movie. She's probably got a future in the MCU as part of a Young Avengers or something of her own in a Disney Plus show. But the role she's playing here is not that exciting of one. She's easily overshadowed quickly by Olsen and Cumberbatch. But I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing. So in all, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness is a fun horror movie that's also very much a Marvel movie that's also very much a Sam Raimi movie. But there's a lot more to talk about that ties everything together in this episode that you're listening to. While Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness is not what I would call a top-tier Marvel movie, there is something special about this movie the more I think about it. What's special about it is Wanda Maximoff's portrayal as a character in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's not uncommon for comic book characters to waver a bit in their dedication as a hero. It's not uncommon for some to even become evil. Now that we're basically kind of going on, 14 years of stories totaling something like 28 movies and 6 TV series on Disney Plus, it's time for us to see a wider swing of character portrayals. Wanda Maximoff is the perfect character to build this on. Remember, she's a character in the comics that has, at times, simultaneously been angry, sad, possibly being manipulated or tempted, heroic, evil, and incredibly powerful. The essence of the character has always embodied that. The movies have used that unfortunate backstory and continued trials and tribulations to basically grow her to this point that we see in this movie. She's a desperate character seeking desperate outcomes. She's never had peace in her life. Her and her brother became orphans thanks to war. She lost her brother in a superhero war against an army of killer robots. Blame was put on her for deaths of people who were also innocents like she once was. She killed her husband only to watch him be killed by someone else when that monster rewound time. She created a happy life only for it to crumble around her. This really opens the door for more complex characters and portrayals. And I'm not saying that you do this with every single character, but it's something you can explore with heavier themes. And theme is an important thing in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. The overwhelming theme of this movie is loss. Of course, as I've stated multiple times now, Wanda is dealing with loss and trying desperately to recover what she lost. Strange, though, is dealing with loss in his own way, too. Early in the film, he goes to the wedding of his former girlfriend, Christine Palmer. He's trying to carry on with a stiff upper lip saying that he's happy, but he isn't. He's lost the one person who meant more to him than anything else. Arguably, it was the one person who could pierce his armor of stuffy self-righteousness originally. He realizes that in every universe, he and Christine were something they could never quite work out the way that really either one of them thought they should. It's through another universe's Christine that he can deal with that and find his own personal resolution to losing that most important person in his life. Then I also got to thinking about how this movie isn't just portraying a new world for these films to move into with new characterizations and exploration of personal themes like loss, but it's also a movie being released in a new world too, where loss can have a personal, real-world feeling to it. Remember Infinity War, the movie that ended with half the universe's population of living beings being wiped from existence? Well, that was released in 2018. Yes, in 2019, we got a couple of movies like Endgame that dealt with that loss, but also had the highs of seeing everyone return. Also, that same year, we saw Spider-Man Far From Home get released, where it touched a little bit on how, people were gone for 5 years. That quote-unquote blip, as it was called, has been explored here and there. Multiverse of Madness takes it one step further and kind of crosses over into real-world loss. At that wedding of Christine Palmer, a former colleague of Strange's sits next to him and tells him how he had been blipped, just like Strange was. While it's great that he came back, he lost his brother who was terminal, and he didn't get a chance to spend his last few months with him. He also lost his cat who died while he was gone. I thought about that and thought about the last couple of years. I thought about all those who had to be so tightly locked down because of other health issues that couldn't see family members during the COVID-19 pandemic. There were sick and elderly people who died alone because of fear of additional contamination by those who were coming in to visit them. It's not too far off from what this guy was dealing with. Yeah, of course, the thrust of the scene was for the guy to ask Strange, a surgeon in a past life that often made quick and correct calls in dicey medical situations, if there was no other way than to have lost that 5 years. In the film, it's meant to give Strange extra weight to bear over how he had to lose to win, which of course is also the overarching character arc Strange has to go through in the movie too. But you get a little bit of connection to real world struggle with how we basically had to be separated for a couple of years from our loved ones too. It's a quiet scene, but one of the best that concerns Strange himself. And finally, let's tie this all back to George Perez. Even after Perez left the Avengers and Kurt Busiek continued on with a few other artists, I still felt the presence of Perez in the series. He laid such groundwork that everyone who followed was still benefiting from it. When Avengers number 500 got released with a new creative team, Brian Michael Bendis and David Finch, a full 2 years after Busiek left the title and 4 years since Perez left, the end of an era was finally upon the title, and in some regards, me too. That started the Avengers Disassembled storyline. It was a story that was meant to take the Avengers through their darkest hour. It would end them as a team, and the one who would strike out against them? Wanda Maximoff, the Scarlet Witch. After years of trying to come to terms with the loss of Billy and Tommy, her quote-unquote sons that she had with the Vision, she snapped. She lashed out against the Avengers and would ultimately create an entirely different reality thanks to manipulations by her brother Pietro. It would soon also spell the end of the mutant race as readers knew it at the time. Scarlet Witch would disappear for years, seen as a terrible threat and a traitor of sorts to her heroic nature and her friends. That hurt me a lot because I loved the character and thought that she was so well molded by Kurt Busiek and George Perez. Comics weren't quite the same for me anymore after that. She would eventually return several years later, but as a whole, the industry had changed quite a bit by then too. Gone were the days of Busiek writing about the Avengers Day Parade and Perez drawing the team in bright colors and dynamic moments against huge threats that didn't always have universe-changing implications, story after story after story. They were just heroes doing heroic things. And I'm not saying that turning Wanda into a villain killed comic books. It just signaled the end of an era. So it's only fitting that the weekend in which the movie comes out that turned the Scarlet Witch into one of the biggest threats to ever exist in the MCU films, the artist who made me love comic books again as an adult, who so lovingly drew every curl in Wanda's lush head of hair, and with the writer who also helped me love comic books again, made Wanda Maximoff the Scarlet Witch one of my all-time favorite characters, well, that artist died. I got to meet George Perez at a lot of conventions, and that was a very lucky thing, I can say. He was so wonderful to the fans. He was wonderful to the industry. And I'm not terribly surprised that I fell out of comics around the time that he retired. Many of the modern comics of the current day don't have the same feel or look as the ones the greats that are now starting to depart did. Just prior to Perez's passing, Neil Adams passed away too. These two were contemporaries and were and are quite consequential when it comes to the Bronze and modern age of comics. They still live on in the pages of those old comics, some of which will get nice new printings as a loving tribute to their greatness. There will always be things that I will see in Marvel movies or comic shops or at comic book conventions when I do visit those places that will make me think of George Perez and the joy he gave my eyeballs every time I picked up a new comic of his. I will always think of those Avengers books he did with Kurt Busiek whenever I look back fondly on my time as a collector. I'll always find a way to drop a Crisis on Infinite Earths reference into an episode of Film Seizure, as I have done, much to Jason Oliver's chagrin, over the past several years. So in the end, what makes this middle-of-the-road Marvel film oddly incredibly special to me comes down to those memories of years past and the joy of picking up those old Avengers books. Maybe I'm not actively a comic reader or buyer today, but I can always think of all those conventions and trips to the comic shop and the excitement when the new issue of Avengers hit the shelves and still smile. I still smile thinking about the greats who have passed away because they play a really big part in my life. I'll miss them, but they live on forever in the four-color world made up of ink and word bubbles. And, strange enough as it is, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness will forever be tied to those wonderful memories that George Perez gave me. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, so you can be made aware of new episodes of our various shows as they drop. You can also follow us at podcast providers like SoundCloud, Google Podcast, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spotify, and Audible. You can also listen to the show on YouTube by subscribing there. And I'll be back this upcoming week with a look at the new Top Gun Maverick and the Bob's Burgers movie. So until then, don't forget to save me the aisle seat.